Welcome back to week 2. This week we're going to be talking about CSS selectors and pseudo-selectors. And some of you are probably thinking like, oh damn, like we spent a week on HTML, like that was hella fast. And I'm still kind of confused on it, but don't worry. That's literally all there is to HTML. Like if we had to teach more HTML, it would just be like slides of each, like of the 100 of thousands of tags that exist out there. So we gave you the really useful ones and the most common ones. And really there's all that there is to it. So yeah. As for CSS, we're just gonna start taking it slow from now on. There are a couple of things that we'd like to go over for the next couple of weeks that are pretty important for building a website. So we'll be covering CSS for like the next 4 weeks, 5 weeks, I think, something like that. Yeah. So a couple announcements. The ad deadline is tomorrow. So if you haven't enrolled in this class yet, you should do so like soon, because your enrollment code that each TA emailed out to you expires after tomorrow. So you wouldn't be able to add this class anymore after tomorrow. So please do that soon. And another thing, homework 1 is technically due, or it was due like 11 minutes ago, but we noticed you guys have a lot of submission issues, and that's normal. So we're extending the deadline to be midnight tonight. So if you guys still have some questions for homework that are lingering, you can just stay on the call after lecture ends, and then we'll try to resolve your issues. So again, homework 1 is extended till midnight tonight, so you can submit on time. So don't do your homework last minute. It's not that hard. So yeah. Also, we have Piazza. Please check the portal submission debugging guide that we posted on Piazza last week. That goes through a lot of steps of how to help you submit in case you're running into errors or issues. We try our best, but sometimes we might not be able to get to your questions immediately because we're students too, and we have to do work also. So please understand. Yeah, so please don't email us if it's about like homework questions. Like just email us in general if you have like logistical questions. That's the whole reason why we have Piazza. So if you have a question about homework, just post it on Piazza as a public or private post. So yeah. If you have any other in-depth questions or need more help, we have our office hours. They're happening every single day of the week on the weekdays. So yeah. And as for last Thursday, the lab sections, we want to apologize for all those technical difficulties and for your understanding. So those links should be fixed now. Again, you don't join this link. This link is only for Tuesday lectures. For Thursdays, you'll be joining your individual cohort TA Zoom link, which is the same as the office hours links as the Piazza logistics post. So keep that in mind. Don't join this one. Yeah, so again, we have feedback at the forum in case you don't like anything about our teaching or you think there could be ways for us to improve. Please fill out the feedback form. It's anonymous, of course. And please add to our Spotify playlist. We have a lot of great songs in here, but most of it's from us staff, and we want to know and learn more about your music taste too. So yeah. So this is an HTML cheat sheet that Asia made. It's super nice. It goes really in depth, and it's super helpful to help you refer to like things you might have forgotten throughout the weeks on HTML. So this is posted on Piazza. She just posted it like an hour ago or something. So please definitely check this out. She put a lot of work into this, and she uses this. I think she uses this to this day still. So it's really, really, really useful. So thank you, Asia, for that. So let's just dive right in. So now that we've learned about HTML, how do we organize our project workspace? And by workspace, what do I mean? Like workspace is just like a word for like an organized folder of like files. So if you can imagine like a complex website, like, I don't know, like Facebook or something, you could probably imagine the amount of code files or like image files or whatever is like insane. There's a lot of files in their workspace. So it's really crucial that when you're building your workspace, you have to keep it organized and clean so that not just you will understand it better when you come back to it like a couple months or a couple of years later, but also maybe you have like collaborators, partners that are working on the same thing. It helps them understand better too. So if you have like all files in just one folder and it's not organized at all, it's not effective for working. So an example of how we do it here at WDD, I just want to point out that this might not be industry standard, but this is a really great start. And we generally do this for like all our assignments and projects. So how we organize our workspace is through this structure. So in our outermost folder, we have the index.html, of course, and then we probably have like an assets folder where like all our static resources go, and then maybe some other subdirectory folders that you might need for organizational purposes. And as for this image on the left, here, actually, I should get my pointer out. This image on the left, you notice like they're indents. If you don't know what these indents mean, it just means like these are subfolders of the parent folder. So images, scripts, and styles, they're indented and they're all within assets. And the same thing like otter.jpg is a picture within the images folder. So that's what these indents mean. So again, assets, this is where all our static resources go. Like maybe we'll have an images folder. That's where, that's of course images. Scripts is where like JavaScript files are, and which we'll go into like in the second half of the semester. And styles is where CSS files are, and we'll dive that. Well, you'll probably be using this folder after today's lecture. Yeah. And we also noticed you guys had a lot of trouble with file pathing. It is a pretty complicated like concept to learn. So don't worry if you don't really understand it. I think this slide will definitely help a little bit. So what relative path is, what you've been doing on the homework, is just a path to another file that is relative to the current file. So like wherever you start, wherever your file is, that's where you start. And this may point to different files depending on the current location. So if you can see, these are all examples. Most of you probably use like this example here, like the assets/images/whatever to your profile picture for homework 1 or whatever. And then underneath it, we have a /, which means stay in the same directory. Like there's really not much of a difference between these two. It's just one is like for executable files, you do /, but that's way into like programming and stuff. So in the scope of this class, these are generally the same. So it doesn't really matter. As long as you have // or no // it's the same thing. But we have a // which means go back up to the parent directory. So this is how we exit a folder instead of going into. So that's done through //. On the other hand, there's absolute path. You don't really need to understand this that much, but the definition is just like a complete path to another file. So I don't know if this is a good anecdote to say, but like imagine typing a web URL, like let's go to YouTube. You're not going to type https://www.youtube.com. That's pretty useless. You could just type youtube.com and that would work the same. Or like you don't need to type the IP address of YouTube every single time, memorize those digits in order to get to that website. So an absolute path is like an IP address or like HTTPS, whatever. That's a complete path. And since it's not relative, these absolute paths always point to the same exact file. They're pretty specific. And it's a pretty subtle difference between relative and absolute path. If you start with just a /, that just means go to the root directory of your local drive. So like by root directory, I mean like this is the directory that contains your desktop folder, your downloads folder, your music, your library, documents, etc. These things. This is your root folder of your computer. That's what this / means. So if anything you take out of the slide, don't use /, at least for the scope of this class, because if you submit and you have / in it, it will tell us, the homework will tell us to look in whatever computer we're on or we're opening, go through that same exact path that should match in your computer, which is probably not going to be the same path for us because we don't even have the image in the first place. So yeah, so keep in mind, we always want to use relative path in this class, which is without a /. This is with a /. Yeah, so for pathing, like this is just a review from last week, how to get to a certain like file from another file. So let's say we're in our index.html and we're trying to get to otter.jpg in our workspace. So this is probably a review for a lot of you, but I noticed a lot of people had issues where their path would dive straight into images and then otter.jpg and totally forget about assets. So this is important to know because when we're in index.html, we're in the same folder as assets, but we're not in assets. So you have to go in assets first. You can't just type images/otter.jpg and assume it works because there is no folder in this outer directory called images, so it's gonna break. So when we first go, we do /assets. That's once we're in assets, we have access to these three folders, and then we go into images, and then we select otter.jpg, and that's how we get from index.html to otter.jpg. However, let's say we're in otter1.html, and that's within the otters folder. So we're not in like the overall folder itself. So if you remember here, like I said, we have a .. and that does the opposite of going into a folder. So we're going back out. So this .. brings us out of otters folder, and now we're in the overall folder with the HTML file, otters, and assets. And then we go into assets, and then images, and then otters.jpg. So that's how you get out of directories and then go back into other ones. So these are good points to learn. Yeah, so again, we usually prefer relative paths to absolute paths, especially for this class. So just focus on relative paths. Cool. So as for CSS, we're going to be starting that today. You probably thought like through homework 1, like, holy, this website's ugly as hell, like, because it's just Times New Roman font, black and white. Like, there's really no other colors besides your profile picture that you added. So it's pretty ugly. But now with CSS, we're able to style things and add life to your websites. So this is the agenda. We're going to be going through these couple things step by step. So don't worry, don't be done. Don't be scared at all. So the first thing we'll be going into is files and linking CSS. So the CSS version we're going to be, or not version, like through this class, we're going to be teaching you external CSS, which means that your CSS code is going to be in a totally separate file from HTML, the HTML file itself, like hence the name external. There's also internal and inline CSS. So like some of you guys for homework 1, like you probably use like for the image, since some of your images might have been super big, you use the width attribute and then you said equals like 200 or something like that. That's called inline CSS, which also works. Yeah, like as you can tell, your images probably shrank. But if you can imagine, like we're going to be applying a lot of styles to one element. And if we do like inline CSS for like all these styles that we apply to this one tag, like it's going to look really ugly in your HTML file. So that's why we teach external CSS, because it keeps our code separate and easy to read. So since our CSS code is separate from HTML, HTML has to know where this file is so that it can apply these rules. So this is where our head tag comes in. So last week in HTML, we were basically like saying head is like useless for now because it doesn't show anything. But now this is where the importance comes in. Within our head tag, we have a link tag. This is a self-closing tag like image. So there's no like opening or closing one, it's just one itself. And this is how we say like this, go to this path and find the CSS file. So we do link, rel equals style sheet. So rel means relation. It's just telling like this HTML file, oh, we're linking a CSS, a style sheet. And then type equals text/CSS. And it just means text means like the code is going to be in CSS. And then href is the path. This is the same thing as like the image source. So this is also the path you go to find our CSS file. So there's no need to memorize this. It's pretty long. I would always just like go back to this slide and copy and paste this stuff and change the path based on my workspace. But Yeah, you definitely don't need to memorize this. Honestly, you don't even need to do this type part. As long as you have rel and href, like that's, it will link the same. It's just for extra like being sure purposes based on browser like compatibility. So yeah, so for this class, our assets or our CSS file will be in assets/styles and then style.css. Cool. So now we know how to link CSS, but what does CSS look like? So this is a generic like CSS selector. We have a couple of components that comprise of a CSS selector. The first of which is an HTML element, which shows like which element we want to change. Within it, we have a CSS property, which means like what aspect of the element we're gonna change, and then property value, which is what we're gonna change that property to. So we're gonna walk through this step by step. So let's just say we're in an index.html file, and we have all this HTML code, and then our CSS styles sheet is a separate file too. So we link it here, and for the sake of this example, the style.css file is in the same folder as index.html, so our path is just the name because we don't need to go into other folders. So we have linked it now, and now this HTML knows where to look for to apply all these rules. So as you can see, our first selector here is you see div, and then within it, it has a lot of like English words. So what this means is that div is our HTML element, and that says that every div in index.html should have these properties. So this div in particular will have the width of 200 pixels, the background of beige, and the text color of dark blue. So color means text color, not background color, because that's just background. So that's what this div will have. And then we also have a second selector, which selects all H1 tags. So all H1 tags in this file, the HTML file, will have these properties. And in this case, we have font size to 32 pixels and then font family to Arial. And that would be specific only for this H1 tag. This P tag, on the other hand, because it's not an H1 tag, it will not have these properties. It will still have the ones in the div, but H1 will have both this and this applied together. So this is a very basic view of like how CSS works and how it ties in with HTML. So again, more clarification, selectors. This tells us what element in the HTML to select or apply certain properties to. So in this case of the selector, we're selecting all divs. Again, all divs in an HTML file will be changed to these properties. And there's a lot of different ways to specify what to select, and it's super powerful, and we'll go into like different ways later on. And then there's the general pair property and value. So again, like I said, property is, for example, font size defines what part of the element we're changing. And then the value, on the other hand, the second half specifies how we're changing it or what it should be changed to. So in our case, font size of this div will be 32 pixels, and the text color within the div will be green. And together, this pair makes a declaration or a rule. So some miscellaneous but small and important things that you should note about CSS is that every rule, like the pairs, should fall in between the curly brackets. So you notice like we have a selector, then open curly brackets, and then list everything inside here, and then close it. If it's outside of the curly brackets, it's gonna break. CSS is not gonna work, and you're not gonna have a fun time. So make sure your properties, your rules are always inside the curly braces. And then you notice how after every rule or every value, there's like a semicolon. This symbolizes like we're ending this line. Like this is one rule and this is another rule. If you did not have this semicolon here after the pixels, it would think color and color colon green would still be applied to, like, still part of this value here, even though it's on a new line. So it's not going to apply font size or color green because it's going to think this whole thing is just one one rule, which doesn't exist. The value doesn't exist because there's no such thing as 32 pixels color green as a value. So make sure you always put semicolons. And like in previous semesters, as in our experience as staff, we've gone through a lot of issues where people have like these weird things that happen on their webpage, and then after like 30 minutes of trying to figure it out, it turns out they forgot a semicolon, like one single semicolon in their files. And it was really annoying and super easy to fix, but hard to find if there's a lot of code. So make sure you always remember the semicolon. And then to comment in CSS, like Nick mentioned last week in HTML, comments is good for just reading purposes, for in case you want to go back and edit code. It's different. The syntax is different in CSS, where you just open with / asterisk, type whatever you want in the middle, and then close with */. So that's how you comment in CSS. So for CSS selectors, how do we select certain elements? So we've already gone through a way to select certain things, but what if we don't want all tags to have the same style? So let's say in our HTML we have 3 p tags, but I want the first and third tag to be green, and then the middle p tag to be blue. So we try out this CSS, like, oh, color green and also color blue. But in this case, it will not work because we're applying the same property twice within a selector. So what this actually does is it will take the very last duplicate and apply it. So you can imagine like all these p tags will be all blue, even the ones that say green text and more green text. So it would first apply it as green, and then as it reads down, it's gonna be like, oh, it said color again. I'm just gonna override green with blue. That's why everything turns blue again. So this is not a proper way to select certain elements if you want them to have different styles. So maybe an attempt would be, okay, let's just separate it into different tags. Each tag would have its own its own HTML tag based on its style. And yeah, that actually works. In this case, like our p tags, if we want it to be green, we just select the p tags and say color green. And then for div, we just say color blue, and that would do its job. But if you can imagine, like on an actual website, you have so many elements and each one probably has its unique style that you're gonna run out of HTML tags really quick. And it would not be good because there's only a finite number of HTML tags that exist right now. So there is a fancier way, but not too hard way to do that, and that's through something called classes and IDs. So this is basically through classes and IDs, we're giving these tags names, like they can be referred to as names. So instead of referring to these p tags as p tags, now I can refer the first and third p tags as green because their class name is green, and then the middle one has an ID of blue. And this is how we select them in CSS. And I'll go into depth in this next slide. So for classes, what they mean is we can apply a set of rules to multiple elements on the page. So a lot of different tags can have the same class name. So how we do that in HTML is in the opening tag of any tag, you add an attribute class equals, and then like in quotes, whatever the name you want to give it. And in this case, we'll say green. So this p tag will have the class name green, same with the second p tag, and the div, even though it's a different HTML tag, it can be named the same class. So so all these elements in HTML are known as green with the class name. So how we select that in CSS, on the other hand, is through a period. So period always symbolizes class and then whatever the name is afterwards. So dot green is how we select certain classes. And in this case, all of these will be applied the color green. So that's how classes work. On the other hand, we have IDs, and this is a way to apply a certain set of rules only to one distinct element on the page. So really only one, in a whole HTML file, only one thing can be named the same ID. On the other hand, like classes, again, like I said, multiple elements can have the same class name. So for this this example, we have a p tag with ID equals blue. So the HTML syntax is very similar in for class, except this time the attribute name is ID equals, and then in quotes, whatever you want to name it. So here we have an ID blue, and how we select that is with a hashtag. So hashtag symbolizes, oh, look for ID with this name. So hashtag blue, apply the color blue. So in this case, our blue text will be in blue. And I just really want to emphasize again that these attributes are all within the opening tag itself. If it's like image, since it's only like one tag, it would go in just that one. It could be named a class or ID or whatever. So yeah. So some tips for remembering the differences between classes and IDs. This is like, it was super useful when I learned this. So for an ID, you can think of your SID. So every student ID is a unique number. And so that's why we use hashtags, because hashtags are numbers. However, for classes, many students take a class or classes. And classes in high school are in periods. So that's why you use a period to select classes. So keep in mind these two differences between selecting IDs versus classes. IDs given is hashtag, and then classes is through periods. So we could also select multiple elements with our selectors. So like generally you could write out like if multiple elements have the same properties, you can like squash them into one selector, basically. You don't have to write it out for every single element that have the same style, because that would just be a waste of time and code. So how we do that is like through commas. So let's say we have 2 p tags and 1 div. They have class 1, class 2, and ID 3. And with commas between each element, we can say like 1, 2, 3. And that's how it says like apply font size 32 pixels to all of these elements here. So again, selecting multiple elements with the same styles just is separated by commas. And then for selecting selecting elements with multiple names, this is a unique feature of classes, because classes can have multiple names within one tag, which is interesting. So take a look at this p tag here. It has both the name green and big, and then the second p tag is just named big. So let's say I just want to select the first p tag, but not the second one. So how do I do that? So we basically in CSS just type both its selectors, .green, .big, without space between. So yeah, this is just means, in English, this means select all elements with both .green and .big class names set within it. Otherwise, just ignore it. Even though, so like, after we apply the CSS, the first p tag will have color green, font size 64 pixels, but the second p tag will be unaffected, because even though it has the same like big name as the other one, it doesn't have both green and big. So yeah, it has to be both of these. It has to have both names or more. It can have like 3 or more names, whatever, to select that certain element. So there's also a way to select nested elements. Like Nick mentioned or emphasized last lecture, nesting is really important in HTML because that's how we organize our certain the elements on our web page. So for here, like let's say we have a div called with an ID J, and the p tag within div called with a class name park. And I just want to select this p tag here and not the outside p tag. So how we do that is put both selectors, but with a space in between. So there's a big difference between having a space between and no space between, given the last slide. So with the space between, what this says in English is like select all elements with a class name park that are nested within J, with an ID J. So here in our example, the first p tag, this first p tag here will have font size 32 pixels, but not the second one, because this one is not within any element with the ID J. So like I said, I want to emphasize there is a huge difference between no space and with space. And this is very important for you to know, because your homework is going to be partially on this stuff too. So keep that in mind. So yeah, before I go into pseudo selectors, are there any questions? That was a lot. You could just unmute if you want anything, or hopefully the queue is going.
I had a question.
Yeah, what's up?
So when you were saying like the differences between tags and IDs, so I was just wondering, like, is it like an ID could only be called once?
No, IDs can be called multiple times in CSS. I just meant like IDs are unique to a specific element. So only one tag or one element on your HTML file should have that ID. If like you say like ID equals like WDD on this element, nothing else can have that same ID, or else it would like mess up some HTML stuff. Does that make sense?
Okay, is this a stylistic choice or is it like a actual like your code would break?
It would actually break if you have like multiple elements with the same ID name. I think what HTML would do would take the very last element with that ID name if it's a duplicate and use that element to apply it, but not like the ones before that. So again, only one element should have the same ID or the ID because it's unique to an element.
And do you set that uniqueness inside the code, or is it like in HTML if you're calling it on all the P's, then
Um, it's just set on in the HTML because you could just name it whatever. It's just
mhm.
after you use that name, you can't use it on anything else. So in this case, like this div has an IDJ, that means no other divs or any other HTML tag should have the IDJ, or else it's not gonna select all of them in CSS.
Oh, so if I had another div tag later in this code, I can't say ID equals J again?
No, you can't. Or else it would only apply the ID to the very last one that has it. So let's say if we had another div tag after this, it would only apply for that div, but it would forget about this one here, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if you want multiple elements with the same stuff, same styles, you can use classes. That's why we have classes, because they can be applied to multiple things. Cool. Any other questions? All right. So for pseudo selectors, this is another form of selectors, but I really enjoy this. This adds a little more pizzazz and some user interaction, or some cool user interactions for people that visit your site or stuff. So what are pseudo selectors? These are selectors that select certain elements that are under a certain state, and they're great for user interaction, like I said. So how the structure of a pseudo selector goes is the normal selector that we just learned the past couple of slides, colon, a pseudo class. So here's like a real life application of it. We have div colon hover. So what this means is that for all divs on the web page, whenever our cursor is hovering over that div or any div, apply these styles to it, which is pretty cool. You can probably imagine, like, if you've been on a website, you hover over a button, like maybe a border will appear or the background color will change or something. That's how you do it. This is through colon hover. Yeah. So here are some common pseudo classes. The colon hover one I just went over. When you hover over something, it'll change. There's colon visited, which is like any links that you've clicked on and visited before, it'll change. So the default is it'll turn purple after you visit it. So it's like Google search. So if you ever search something up, you click on the first link and then you go back to the search, that link will turn from blue to purple. So that's what it means by like you visited this link before. There's also colon active. So that's when the mouse is currently clicked on something. So this is different from when it hovers, because hover, you're not clicking down on it, but active is when you're clicking down on this element. Apply these rules. And if you go to this link here, there are so many, many, many more pseudo classes that you can use. It's just these are the most common ones that you'll definitely use these for your projects. So yeah, these are really fun to use. I just want to point out that a lot of students in the past have confused like the selector. They've added like spaces between the colons, or like div space colon hover or div colon space hover. There are no spaces. at all between these selectors. It's all technically one word you can say, because if you add spaces, it'll break. The selector won't do its work. So don't add spaces between them. Cool. So for summary, just CSS makes everything pizzazzy, it makes everything fancy. And we taught you external CSS, which goes in a separate file. And this, again, is a command that you don't have to memorize. This is how we link it in HTML that goes in the head tag. And then this is what a selector looks like. And then I'll just skip these slides. We're kind of running out of time. But this is how we select elements based on tags, class IDs, and then how we select multiple elements. And then same thing for pseudo selectors. We can apply the same concept. So yeah, there's like a ton of like hundreds of freaking CSS properties out there. I probably don't even know the majority of them. You probably will never use a lot of them because they're pretty useless. But these are a lot of very important ones that you can look on your own time, and you'll be using these a lot. So yeah, there's also the really important ones for spacing, how you add space between elements or like here and there. And Asia will actually go into this in more depth in the design lecture on spacing. So yeah. So as for colors, you probably noticed like throughout all our slides, like we used the English words, blue, yellow, green, like I want those in those colors. These are like preset values for like the website to render. But there's also, since there's like trillions of different like colors out there in the world, you can use what's called a hex value for that color. So if you go to Google Color Picker, it'll take you here. Like, let's say I'm just trying to figure out what color my website should be in. And I was like, okay, I'm playing around with this color for Google Picker. I like this color. This is the color I want. And here is the hex value for it. So all I need to do is copy this hex value with the hashtag. And then in the property of CSS, where it says like color or background color or anything that has to do with color, just do background or color colon this hex value here, semicolon. So that's how you apply a ton of different like colors out there in the world. Cool. And if you're wondering, WDD green is this certain hex value. So yeah. So I'm just gonna go into a quick CSS demo. Wait, just to make sure, Asia, do you need the full time for design lecture? Asia? Okay, all right, let's just go into the demo then. We'll just briefly run through it quickly. What the
I
heck?
responded to chat. I guess you didn't hear, but I was like, I can make do with whatever time.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Why is it not giving me this link? So if you want to walk through this demo with me, go ahead. The slides are posted on the portal. So I guess it doesn't work when I go into presenter view. Okay, cool. So here we have a JS bin. JS bin is just this online kind of like text editor that automatically compiles and renders code, HTML, CSS code for you in the like this output section. So any changes you'll make will automatically be added. So the cool thing about this is that I don't need to like specifically use the link tag here, like type link, because this is the feature of like this website. So I won't go into that, but cool. So if you open this, you'll see like a comment where it shows like a couple things that I want you to do. We'll just go through this one by one. So this is a little nicer version of homework 1 of our very awesome TA, Susan. So she was fortunate enough to let me use her as an example for the demo. So here we have, the first question is like, oh, like H1, we want the font size to be 36 pt and margin bottom of 0 pixels. So how we do that is we want all H1 tags in the HTML file to have these properties. So we just say H1, and then font size is the property name, and the value is 36 pt. PT means point. That's one of the units of measurements in here. There's like pixels, points, EM, percentage, VH, VW, like there's so many, but for the most part, you guys could use pixels and percents and that would work fine. So we got the font size, but there's also margin bottom of 0 pixels. Honestly, this is like, I think this is default. We don't really need to say this because it's 0 by default, but that's how you do in CSS too. So clearly we see, wow, like Susan, the name Susan Chen got bigger already. So again, if I like take this out, it's small, but if I add it back in, boom. See, like this, that's the cool thing about this JSBin website. It just automatically renders for you. So we'll be using a lot of examples and demos through this website. So I'm gonna just skip this one. This is the same thing, but they're like select an image with an ID profile. If your profile pic does not have an ID yet, add to it. So we can see here, like this is where our image tag is. That's a long URL. So we can add an ID by just adding an attribute ID equals, I'm gonna say profile because that's what the question asked me. So now this image tag has the ID name profile. So how we select that again, IDs are unique. Like a SID is a number and that's selected through a hashtag. So hashtag profile and then whatever. So they're like, make it into a circle. And what property this means is there's something called border radius, which is like specified how curvy the border is. And I'm gonna say 100%. And wow, it's a circle. Susan is now in a circle. Cool. And then next question is using this ID when it's hovered on, rotate it 360 degrees. Ooh, it sounds fancy. So we're selecting the same ID, so we could say profile again, but only when it's on hover. So this is a pseudo selector, so colon hover. And then we open the curly brackets and within, we have to rotate it 360 degrees. It says, hint, use the transform property and the transition property. What do these do? So this is a property that you can use called transform. And within it, there's a value where you could do rotate. And rotate takes like a certain number. And you can say 360 deg. Deg is a unit value of degree. So you think like, oh, now like I can transform it. If I hover on it, it'll work. But now I'm trying to hover on it, it still doesn't work because we have to specify how long this hover effect will last, which is where the transition property comes in. So transition, and then this takes a certain amount of time as its value. So let's say 0.5 s. S stands for seconds. So now if we hover, whoa, Susan now spins. I just find this really funny. So every time we hover on Susan's picture, it'll take 0.5 seconds to rotate 360 degrees. Wow, so fancy. So now you can add some really fancy, cool effects on your websites. Amazing. And yeah, that's basically all there is to this question. If you want solutions, they're down here on the slides. And yeah. Here are also really helpful links for CSS practice. I think like W3 schools and Stack Overflow are your best options of learning these kinds of concepts because they really got me through this class when I was taking it too. So definitely check out these links when you can if you want to learn more about CSS, especially this CSS selectors link. It'll go in depth of the selectors we just talked about today and how to select certain elements. So I think that's it. Any questions about CSS? I know this was a lot, but you always have these slides to refer back to.
I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
Is there an advantage to setting something to an ID versus a class?
Not really. It's just for like organizational purposes. So let's say like your logo on your website is like, that's a unique thing, right? Nothing else would have the same properties. So you'd probably use an ID for that. Like you could use a class with a name and never call it for anything else but a logo. But it would work the same as an ID, but it's just used for like, its purpose is just there for like, maybe it's easier to understand if it's an ID rather than a class. Because if I see class on the HTML, I'm just gonna assume that for the most part, there's gonna be more elements with that same name. That's why you use the class. So on the other hand, like let's say, I don't know, what, like Pinterest. It has like this like grid like card thing where every like card has its image. You can imagine this card, even they look the same, so you probably assume that these cards have the same elements and all these cards share the same class name. So that's the difference of using it. Again, like you don't need to use classes IDs. You could use all classes and that would work the same. But yeah, it's just for reading purposes. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. Any other questions?
Yeah, when you have multiple selectors like green and big, do green and big, do you have to have a separate green and a separate big for that to work? Or can you just, you know what I'm saying?
Like select elements with multiple names?
Yes.
So where was that slide? Like this example here?
Yes, like would you have to have a big and a green, or can you just have the big green and that's it? Like
so if
this,
oh,
go ahead.
so yeah, if you only want to select this first element here because it has both names green and big, you have to specify both of its names in order to select it. Or I mean, you could select green and it'll do the same thing. That also works if that's your question. Because this one doesn't have the name green. So if you just select green, it would just apply to this first one. It'd be the same effect as green big. However, if we just say we just select big and exclude the green, we say big has color green and font size 64 pixels. Since both of these have the same big name, it would apply to both of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
What if we had like a separate green and then a separate big and they had different things inside it and then we did green big? Would it like apply both of them, or would like one get overridden by another? Would it error?
So you're saying like let's say we take out big here and then we have like
leave
class
green big there, and instead of doing dot green dot big, what if you had like a dot green and then something in there and then a separate dot big and then something in there?
Yeah, so dot green again would just select the first one and apply whatever you want in there, and then another selector dot big would apply the stuff to both of these. So if you have like color for both of them, it would just apply whichever comes later, the latest thing. So you could like make selectors and change like element styles in like an infinite possible ways. That's the fun thing about CSS, because there's really no right answer of styling a certain element. Like if you want to make a button, there's like tons of ways out there to make it in the shape of a button rather than one way. So all you CS, math majors, STEM majors thinking like one logical flow is correct, that's wrong. That's the fun thing about CSS. So yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. I'm just gonna hand it over to Asia now because kind of over time, sorry about that. But yeah, she's gonna now teach you guys about spacing and visual hierarchy. Woo.
Yeah, so this might be low-key speed round, but let's do this. So this is visual hierarchy through spacing, and it's probably one of the most, if not the most important lecture that we have for design. So yeah, let's get into it. So the main three things that we're going to cover are the importance of space, macro and micro level spacing, and if we have time still, a spacing demo. If we don't, I'll just record it and upload it later. So yeah, the importance of space. What is wrong with these user interfaces? So let's start with this one. If you just want to unmute and just say something quickly.
Too much on
Anybody?
the screen.
So cluttered, super crowded.
Yeah.
Overwhelming.
These are all true. Same goes for this one, I feel. Is there anything else that jumps out at you about these two? Hasn't been said?
there is no hierarchy, you don't know really where to look first.
That's a really good point, and we're going to get into that almost immediately. Yeah. So, as you guys said, the UI is cluttered, it's crowded, it's overwhelming. So yeah, what's wrong with cluttering other than the obvious that you don't know what you're looking at? Basically, users won't see that much content because loss of visual hierarchy is overwhelming, like I said, and quality over quantity in content that you have on a page. Yeah, you don't know what to look at. You don't know what you're supposed to be looking at. You don't know what's important, and you lose information by not being able to understand all that. So yeah, user attention is a precious resource, and you should be allocating it accordingly. So you want to make sure that the main things that you want to get across with your website, whether this is like a branding goal or whatever, you want to make sure that that is the main focus, and the main use is also the main focus. So yeah, using space intentionally establishes a hierarchy of information, kind of as Juliana mentioned. You will understand what is important at different levels, and we'll go into how to do that in a second. So a little bit of terminology. Positive space is the space on the screen or whatever you're designing that is actually filled by content, and the negative or white space is the opposite of that. So that's where it's empty, space between paragraphs, and it creates emphasis on the positive space because the less positive space there is, the more you know what to look at. So this is an example of an Apple store. They do a really good job of spacing with things. You can see that they're super wide, I guess, aisles between where you would test out different products. And this has a very comforting feel, and people know what to look at while they're there, and they don't feel overwhelmed by everything that they have to look at. If you want to talk about more about that stuff, come to my office hours. So yeah, we're going to break down the Google homepage because it has a great example of negative space versus positive space. So kind of everything that doesn't have anything in it, as I said, is the negative space. So all this area down here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, and just everywhere in this white area. And then the positive space, mainly in the center with the Google logo and the search bar buttons, that bottom menu as well. So yeah, more white space, more emphasis. On the left, you can see that the text we have there draws your attention right to it, whereas on the right, where it says less white space, less emphasis repeatedly, the words kind of blur together into one shape, and you're just kind of like, yeah, that's text. So you want to consider that when you design your website. So spacing between lines, you know, when teachers ask you to do double spacing in your essays, there's a good reason for that. It's more readable. You see on the left, there's this really squished paragraph of lorem ipsum filler text, and it just kind of seems like a swarm. You don't really want to stop and read that. Whereas on the right, all the lines are more spread out and you can read them better. And it's just more pleasing on the eye. So let's move into macro and micro level spacing. So macro level spacing is the space between core elements of the page, and it creates structure and breathing room. So here's the first view, oh my gosh, that you have on the page, and then maybe you want to have another section below it, and just structuring your content throughout the whole thing that people are going to scroll through. Yeah, we'll take a look at that in a second. And micro level spacing, it increases legibility and understanding of text and information. So yeah, more on that in a few lectures. We'll cover it briefly momentarily. So Stripe, unfortunately, it doesn't look like this anymore, but it still looks great. They have a wonderful design team and a great website, and we're going to use their website, or the original website, to show how macro and micro spacing works. So macro level spacing, again, is page sections. They have it clearly denoted without having strict boxes visual to us. We put a box around it so that you could see where the navigation bar is, where the text is on the page introducing who they are, what they do, what's unique about them in a really concise way. And they use background colors and white space to create separation. So most websites have straight across lines, they have diagonal lines, but they still create the same structure within the website that's extremely unique. Then micro level spacing is spacing between individual sections on a page. So this is a zoomed in look on the intro text from the home page, and they have a certain amount of spacing between the new banner, then the header text, and then the paragraph text, and then another space between the paragraph text and the buttons. And actually, when you do designing in design software, which we'll get into maybe with the Figma lab, you'll learn that this kind of balance of spacing is super important to making designs look good, and making this uniform is even more important to making designs look good. That's not a hard rule. So next is padding and margin. So padding is the space within the border of an element. So as you can see, the space that kind of goes around the word submit within the button. And margin is the spacing between elements. So it's the spacing between each submit button with the other submit buttons. And you'll see this more practically in a second. So in CSS, Howie briefly covered this, but there's the box model for spacing. So the 40 by 40 blue rectangle that's on the screen represents what your actual content is. Doesn't actually have to be that size. And all these numbers here you don't technically have to follow, they just work out nicely, but not in every case. So then right around the main content, but still within the div that you're working with, that's that hard black line right here, is the outer edges of that div or container that you're working in, your content. There's the padding, then there's the border of it, if you think of it as a picture. The padding is kind of like the mat, whereas this blue box is the actual art piece, and then the border is the frame, and then around that is like outside of the frame is the margin. I can do a better example of that eventually. So line width, we talked about this a little bit. Narrow or paragraphs are easier to read. There's less scanning the eyes, and you can use a diff to restrict the width of the text. So as you can see here, the text doesn't extend all the way across the page. It only extends like halfway through. And that makes it easier to read. You don't have to like go all the way from one side of the screen to the other, as you'll see in our example. So this is Medium, and they are a company / website that is kind of blog posts by pretty much anyone, and it's just all collectivized. So it's just a lot of reading on that website, and it's incredibly useful for learning about design. That's how I got into it. But as you can see, the text that they have is only within the middle, and you don't have to look back and forth that far to read what's on the page. So yeah, you can compare the differences here. The top one, text goes all the way across, and the bottom one already looks better, even though the only thing that's different is the line width. It's much shorter. So metrics, margin and padding around element should be consistent and equal. It's what I said before. So an easy way to decide this is use simple multiples for spacing and other metrics. So factors of 10, factors and multiples of 10, multiples of 4 also work really well. So 12, 16, etc. So yeah, simple is not the same as barren. We talked about how important white space is to drawing your attention to things. But if there's too much white space, it can also kind of make the elements on the page dissociate from each other. So as you can see here, this is an example of the old CS61B website. Thankfully, it is no longer like this, but even though there's plenty of white space, you still don't know what to focus on. Everything still seems of the same importance, and it just feels extremely bland and boring. Yeah, so this is what it currently looks like. It's much better. You can see that there's different structure because white space is balanced, or at least more defined in the new site. So yeah, avoid the barren, make your spacing intentional through rhythm, asymmetry, and or gestalt principles. Gestalt principles, which you'll have a reading about eventually, is a bunch of these patterns and things that humans are able to pick out from, I guess, visual stimuli. And it's really important to know in design because they predict what humans will expect to happen with what you design, how they'll read the page, how they'll interact with it. These are all part of Gestalt principles. So yeah, creating a rhythmic structure. We're looking at the Stripe website again. Rhythm creates structure and reliable patterns for content. The space and content structure are used to define this rhythmic pattern. So as you can see, there's a flow throughout, there's a flow throughout the page. And even though the sections are well defined, you still feel like they're all well connected and incredibly cohesive. And yeah, you easily understand how everything is grouped as soon as you look at it. So for symmetry and asymmetry, we'll cover this more in our layouts lecture towards the end of the class, I believe. But symmetry creates balance with repeating patterns and the rhythmic structure. So the vast majority of sites are symmetric because it's easier to make look good. Instagram has it. It's also easier on the user to read and understand what's going on. Yeah, I'm sure you can think of lots of many other examples of sites that use symmetrical layouts. And then asymmetry, you can use it to create emphasis. So when everything is symmetrical, everything can be of the same importance with each other. Like as you see, these 4 squares over here are all kind of in the same size and it's symmetric over there. You know, okay, those are all of the same importance level, same with the navigation bar. But when you have the larger Adobe logo, that kind of breaks the symmetry of the page. You're like, oh, hey, that's actually important. That's where your eyes go to. So yeah, the larger thumbnails creates emphasis through sizing. And you can use this to accentuate different parts of your content and what you're creating. I'm seeing a lot of things happening in chat. So I'm gonna pause really quick. Okay, it seems like it was covered. And we still have time because I really sped through that. But if we want to go through some questions, or if you want me to go over anything again, I can do that before we do the demo. Is there anything I need to go over again? You can just unmute yourself if you want.
I had a question about the box model.
Yeah.
Back to that slide. I didn't get like the numbering.
Okay, so as I said before, the numbering isn't actually super important. Here, it's an example of how you would pick the spacing in between. So it's supposed to be like 16 pixels and 32 pixels. We'll be covering the box model more next week, so it's totally okay for you to not completely understand this. But yeah, you don't need to worry about these exact numbers pretty much at all.
Okay.
Did that answer your question?
Well, yeah, but also like, why is it 40 by 40 in the middle, but it's not a square and it's like smaller?
You know, I don't know.
Okay.
This is like the standard image. I don't think it's, like, as I said, the numbers aren't that important. It's supposed to be like a visualization of kind of how the different types of spacing and CSS work with the content that you're trying to put in.
Okay.
And where that spacing or setting will go.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, as Howie said, it will be taught in depth for the programming section next week. Does anyone else have any questions before I continue? If not, I can just move on to the demo. Yeah, I also wanted to make a quick note before we continued, and while I switch over to Figma, that another thing about cluttering and making things close together, this is more important if you're designing for mobile, which we won't really cover in this class, but it makes it less accessible for people. It's still true though on websites. There are a lot of people with physical disability or other disability. Having things super cluttered makes it difficult to click on things properly, interact with things the way that they want to, and it can be extremely frustrating even if you're not disabled. So just making it accessible for anybody and making them feel like they're welcome and that it's a fun thing, an easy thing to use. So yeah, let me. For some reason, it's not letting me screen share. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is Figma. I'll cover more on how to use this next week in lab, but if you guys could just unmute yourselves and tell me some things that are wrong, some things that we need to fix about this, and why.
I feel like the lines are too close. If you put some more room between them, it makes it a little easier to read.
So what do you mean by the lines?
Like in the paragraphs, like it's like
Mm-hmm.
they're just like very stacked up, and when you look at it, it's like a lot of overwhelming text. In your slide, you had showed like having like double spacing or like 1.5 spacing.
Yeah, so let's do that really quickly. I'm going to do 50%, and as you can tell, that already looks better. I'm gonna move things back up to where they were as I go along. But feel free to say other things while I fix it.
I think the margins are kind of small. Feels like super kind of like cramped and stuff.
Mm-hmm. So is there a particular part where that's true or just the whole thing?
Mainly just on like the paragraph, like your main body, yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's do something like that. I'm not gonna make it super perfect, but I'm actually gonna make it better. But yeah, something like that maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good. Is there anything else? Anybody? That seems wrong.
Oh, sorry.
No, yeah, go ahead.
I feel like the picture on the bottom could be a little bigger so it like matches the pictures on top size-wise.
Mm-hmm. So how big do you think it should be?
Like right now is fine.
Okay. Oops.
I feel like there could be more white space next to the first two images that are side by side, both with respect to each other and also to the paragraph text above and below.
Okay, so what would you recommend I do?
I think we can move like the images and all the bottom text a little bit down, and then in terms of the two images, either like I feel like if we separated them more, that would make the margins on the left and right too small. So maybe either making one image bigger and the other smaller, or putting them like not necessarily side by side.
Yeah, so maybe something like this. And I'm going to cheat a little bit. This is definitely allowed. And pretend that we have some subtext right here. How about that? Let me move the other text up. So yeah, that's a good suggestion because it gives asymmetry. You can also make it have the same margins. I'm really glad that you kept that in mind while you did that. Figuring out how to use the space with what you have to put on there is really good. Is there anything else that needs to be changed? Anybody can answer.
This is more of a general comment, but like with what you're saying, like less is more. Like I feel like it looks better now, but somehow it feels like there's a lot to say. Like finding some way to separate the text out a little more so it doesn't feel like there's just a lot of things coming at you.
Yeah, we can give even more space to things. For sure. So another thing that I'm going to go in and do is increase the space between paragraphs. I don't know how obvious that was to you guys, but there's a setting in Figma that lets you change the space between paragraphs. So I moved it up from the base of 0 to 2, and that kind of helps. And then I guess giving more generous amount of space works out. You know, maybe having everything in the same alignment also helps. Let me move this up a little bit. Is this kind of what you were thinking about? I didn't do the bottom part, but
Yeah, that was what I was getting at.
yeah, we can make that more too. Okay. So I'm going to go through and do a couple more changes and I'll talk through it. So earlier I moved the title and the, I guess, blog post subtext in alignment with everything else to make sure that everything is relatively symmetrical and aligned, because again, that break in alignment would give unnecessary emphasis on these two things. And also it just looked kind of jarring that they weren't aligned with everything else. And yeah, giving extra space around pictures, making sure things are readable. I would actually probably make this image bigger, but that's just personal preference. Just to make sure that the alignment is the same is also not necessary. I think having it just within the sides of the main margins is good enough. And yeah, I guess make this 1.5 also. And that's pretty much the demo. You guys figured it out pretty quickly, pretty well. So I'm gonna go back to the slides. So yeah, some things to note. As Howie mentioned before, I make cheat sheets for general topics in this class, typically for coding. Let me know if you want some for design. I think I said that on Piazza as well when I posted it. If you're interested in visual hierarchy and kind of like the relationship between software and design, and you're kind of ready for a challenge or more advanced topics, check out the Medium article that I have linked in the slides. And I also mentioned earlier that we'll be doing the Figma demo / walkthrough next week. So have a Figma account or have it downloaded on your computer. By next week, I'll make a post on Piazza about it so you know exactly what you need to do. But yeah, that's what we'll be covering. And just a quick reminder to fill out our anonymous feedback form, especially because we're just trying things out for the first time for the most part. And yeah, and I'm pretty sure people's office hours have started as well. And I guess also another reminder that that doesn't have to be technically for like, oh, you need help with the homework or anything. You can just come and chat with us about career design stuff or coding stuff in general. And yeah. Questions? Anybody? In the last couple of minutes. Let me check the chat. Yeah, if there's, we'll stick around for a little bit, but if there are no questions, I guess you guys are free to go. And also, I guess one more thing from messages is that if you had problems submitting the homework that was due today, you have until midnight. And yeah, you can stick around after if you need help with submitting it as well, and we will help you with that.